So hopefully you all have a big surplus this year. Hopefully at the end of 2018 you're dealing with a surplus and you're like, hey, great, what do we do with this surplus? So there's a couple things you can do with it. You can transfer it into the contingency reserve fund. Okay, this is an interesting topic. I'm going to come back to it. You can carry it forward as part of your operating fund as a surplus carry forward, or you can use it to reduce the total contributions to the next year's operating fund. So let's go through the options. Option 1, transfer into the contingency reserve fund. There's some debate in the industry on how this mechanism works because it's not really clear in the Strata Property Act on how that works. So we feel best practice is that if you're going to take some of the surplus and move it into CRF, you include that in as your proposed budget. So in your proposed budget, you just say, you know, we had a surplus of $38,000 and we're going to move that forward into the CRF. And then when the owners vote to approve the budget, they're approving that. There's some argument that says that the Strata Council can just move it into the CRF at the end of the year. We haven't found anything that says you can't do it, but I think it's cleaner if the owners are approving. And I think it's just better for everybody, transparency, if that's the way it's done. And so we're going to say that's best practice. The next one is carry forward part of the operating fund as a surplus. So carrying forward a surplus is not a bad thing because it helps with cash flow. So if you run a really tight budget or you're a young strata, having a 2 or 3% surplus carried forward gives you some cash flow responsibility, some flexibility. So if you can't afford to pay for things because you're in a cash restraint position because maybe the owners aren't disciplined on paying on the first of the month, then that surplus lets you have some flexibility and you're not going to run out of cash. Sometimes we have stratas that budget so tightly, they can't pay their bills to maybe the 5th of the following month because they need the strata fees to roll in from all the owners. So it's not a bad thing to carry a surplus. You don't necessarily need to. We don't encourage you to carry these massive surpluses over. So some strata corporations will carry forward like 30% of their budget in surplus. Technically speaking, the owners haven't approved the Strata Council to spend that money. Right? They've approved a surplus carryover. And so if the Strata Council goes and uses that money, whether they have permission of the owners is debatable to use it. What it could be good for is if you run a deficit next year, then you can talk to the owners and you could use that surplus to erase that deficit if that happened. So what we're saying is the goal is to have no surplus carryover, but we see the practical sense to have a small carryover if your strata might run into cash flow restraints. Do you have anything to add on that, Dylan?
Yeah, if you're constantly getting emails from the strata managers saying we're having a cash flow crunch, we're having a hard time paying A, B, C, D, this is kind of that issue. The flip side of that is if there's a massive, massive surplus that's carried forward into the preceding year, the question you might receive from owners, and it's a fair question, is, well, why aren't my strata fees coming down, which kind of ties into number C, this third bullet point here. So I think that point is exactly, it's maintaining cash flow, and I think that's only relevant if you're experiencing that cash crunch. But I generally want to dissuade big balances because you encourage owners to ask that question, which is fair.
Okay, then good point, Dylan. So the last one is you can use the surplus to lower the strata fees fundamentally for the next fiscal year. Okay, so you could use that as income and the strata fees therefore wouldn't have to go up, or if there's an increase, so they could go down. Now, it's kind of like a kid with a credit card though. It's good in theory, but you just have to be careful and you have to really communicate with the owners. The reason being, say strata fees are going to go up 6%, but you use the surplus, right, or the owners approve the surplus, so that there's no strata fee increase at all. It's zero, okay? That's cool, except for next year, maybe you get a 2% increase, plus now you have the 6% you got to pay for, and you don't have the surplus to use, therefore you got now an 8% or 10% increase, and so it's a big shock. So if you're going to use a surplus, that's fine, but you need to either do it in small doses, so maybe you're going to reduce the strata fee increase from 2% to 1% or whatever it's going to be. That's great, but you got to communicate to the owners, hey guys, next year we're not going to have the surplus, so do expect that you're going to have that increase that we didn't have this year on top of any increase we have next year. So it's just an over communication and that you can do. I like using that surplus reduced strata fees if there's a big change. Like if your strata fees are going up significantly, maybe you decide to start contributing to the contingency reserve fund in a greater amount. You could step it in by using some of that surplus, or you can just get creative in how you use it. But in general, you just have to communicate to the owners if you do use it, or if it's in the proposed budget that, hey, we're not going to have this next year. So that's really what you can do with the surplus, and hopefully you all have surpluses. Deficit, dun dun dun. So deficit has to be taken care of in the next fiscal year. So what that means is you got to deal with it. The way you can deal with it is you can have a special levy of the owners. You can use reserve funds, and that's all, you have to get approval obviously. And then, or you can carry it forward to the next year and roll it into the strata fees for the next year. If the deficit is minor, rolling it in is a great idea, right? If you have $1 million budget and your deficit is $4,000, just roll it forward. It's not worth the amount of money. It'll probably get absorbed at the next year's budget. If your deficit is $50,000, then that's probably not something you want to roll in, because what will happen is it'll make your strata fees artificially high, right? And that if people are trying to buy into the building, the strata fees are going to be artificially high, which means it's going to be harder for them to get a mortgage. So we would say try not to roll significant deficits forward because the strata fees are going to go up quite high, and it could be detrimental to purchasers in the future. So it's difficult, but sometimes the best thing to do is just say, hey, we had a deficit, we had it because of these reasons, you know, we're going to have a special levy, or we're going to take it from the reserve, and we're going to blend, or we're going to do a blend of it or something like that. So we encourage you to just take the bull by the horns and address the matter, but sometimes that isn't practical, and you can, if it's small, you can roll it forward.